Okay, I'm sitting here with Andrew Adams, who has published a lot of short fiction and some longer works, but most recently, he published Serial Publication, which I read and reviewed and really enjoyed. And so there's a lot of things in it that I want to talk to you about today. How are you, Andrew?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
Very good. Very good. Thanks so much for coming on. Um, What the way I want to start here is just to have you talk about some of your published works, and then maybe we'll dive into serial publication a little bit deeper.
Sure. So far, I've got three short story collections called Symposium of the Reaper, Volume 1, 2, and 3. And those have been probably the most well received by readers. Um, Also, just a huge passion of mine is doing short stories. And then I have one novel aside from serial publication called Constructing Entropy. And that's what I have published as of right now.
Nice. And I love talking to people about their short fiction because so we've had a bunch of people on here. Angela Sylvain does short fiction and long fiction. Patrick Barb, he goes back and forth. And JV Gax even, she does. And I'm very bad at writing short stories, which is why I always like to ask people what it's like going back and forth between I almost think about them as two different mediums, two different goals in mind, right? You're trying to pack a punch in a really small amount of time with short fiction. So do you approach it any differently from something like, say, serial publication, a longer form work?
I don't know, the approach is different, but the ideas are definitely different. For example, one of my short stories is called Killers Anonymous, and that's kind of been a reader favorite. Exactly how it sounds. I wouldn't write a whole novel about a Killers Anonymous meeting. So I'm able to kind of play around with ideas a little bit better in short stories and experiment and do things like that. Another story I did is called The Hunger It Aches. It's kind of a cannibalism story. Um, Probably wouldn't do a whole novel on that. So there's a little bit more freedom in short stories versus a novel. You're trying to put your best foot forward at all times. Um, as far as approach, even when I'm writing a novel, I try to cut the fat, no filler. Try to just get right to the point all the time. So at least that approach is the same.
Which is
Yeah.
interesting you say that because a serial publication read to me almost like a lot of it read like a stage play because it's very tight and confined and there's a lot of back and forth, and so you have large sections where it's very dialogue heavy, and then you have some procedural elements where they get outside the building and start investigating crimes. And now we're going off on a tangent about serial publication. Why don't you give us a synopsis of what's going on with that?
With serial publication.
Yes, please.
So we're looking at the settings 2031. We have a serial killer named Charles Proctor who works his way into a reality show that's broadcast around the world, where he can be the star of his own show and really detail the crimes that he's committed. And in his mind, like many serial killers, he's doing a service. Is not a crime. He's helping people. So the message needs to be heard.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, you describe it very succinctly, but there's even a lot more to it than that, you know. There's a lot that goes into it in terms of uh near future intrigue with how our news media could potentially develop or how it could devolve in a way.
Mhm.
There's oh gosh, there's elements of it that almost play like, I don't know if you ever saw that Gerard Butler movie Law Abiding Citizen, where
Yeah.
he's basically using the justice system to his advantage to kind of like make a mockery of the entire system.
Mhm.
It's a similar thing like that, and I really like the way that you portray your serial killer within the story because he's very calm and collected, and he knows he has all the cards to play, right? So did you do any serious research into serial killer methodology or psychology for this, or was it just something that you ran with yourself?
A little bit of both. I've done a lot of research in the past for other projects as well. And then before writing, I was a filmmaker as well. So some of those
Ooh,
projects that I've,
yeah, we should talk about that then, because I didn't know that.
yeah, we can. Well, I was an amateur, never did it professionally, but um, so some of the projects that I've worked on in the past, even for on the film side, uh, some of that knowledge kind of bled through for sure.
Awesome. Um, and what about the social commentary aspect of it? Because to me, it's heavy, but in a good way. It's very satirical, and to me, you can't really have the story without that piece. So, was that always something that you intended to for it to be a comment, as I saw on the state of our news media? I called it what I say in my review, if it bleeds, it leads commentary, right? Was it something that you intended, or was it something that came about as you were writing the story?
Both, definitely intended and also expanded upon that while I was writing. A lot of it was drawn from my experiences in the workplace and government agencies I've worked with, and that's a whole other thing. But I've done a lot of contract work for military and government type of things, so kind of see behind the curtain a little bit. And sometimes you don't want to know how the sausage is made, you know. Um, but the impetus for the story started with Charles for sure, and then the butterfly woman being flayed like a butterfly. That was the first idea that I had. Um, the reality show aspect, that was something I've been wanting to touch on as well. So just combine the two, and here we are.
Yeah, and it's really, really cool. And you mentioned the people getting flayed like butterflies and whatnot. One thing I really appreciated about it was the violence never really seemed all that gratuitous. It seemed like you're really, really focused on making more of a meta commentary on the state of like reality TV and whatnot, and not really focusing on the violence, which I thought was great. So that leads me into my next question. When people go to read an Andrew Adams story, did you say that there's anything in particular they can expect? Do you have a certain kind of brand with the stuff you write?
Yes, yeah, I would say more
Don't
of
don't be
those.
humble. Don't be humble now. Let's talk yourself up.
Yeah,
You've put out what, three short story collections and a longer piece. I mean, you know what you're doing at this point. So what's an Andrew Adams story like?
gonna get a lot of variety. My first novel, Constructing Entropy, is vastly different from serial publication, even though they both have a serial killer in there. Um, Constructing Entropy is probably more American Psycho, something along that lines. Um, so I think there's a voice that you kind of develop over time, and I tend to mix a lot of humor in as well. Maybe not so much in serial publication, but there's probably a few aspects in there. I always wanted to take the Tarantino approach, going back to film. Um, every film that he does is pretty drastically different in genre, but it's still a Tarantino film. So that's kind of my mindset when I'm working on something new.
So even though you said you're an experienced amateur filmmaker, would you say that your experience doing filmmaking has in any way informed the way you write prose? Because usually, to me, people who do a lot of screenwriting, you can tell there's a lot of brevity in their prose because you have to write that way with screenwriting. So what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think so because I try to gloss over details that quote don't matter. Like I said before, cut the fat. I try to gloss over describing every single detail of something or someone's appearance. I give allusions to it, but I try to also leave that in the reader's mind. And that's also something that I like to do for pretty much short story or long fiction is allow the reader to make certain connections. So you can read serial publication as, oh, it's a serial killer, it's a story, it's like Seven or something like that. Or you can dig into it as deep as you want to, and the philosophical side and the satirical side. So I think by cutting out some of the the details that don't really matter, honestly, it allows people to make those connections in their brain
Yeah.
on their own. So
Yeah, and I call myself an ADHD style reader. So
yeah.
if something is too detailed, then it will lose me pretty quickly, you know. So I do appreciate the brevity in your writing. So what do you do for a living when you're not writing?
So a long story is I'm a welder by trade. So I've been a welder for my entire career. And as of recently, I've become a high school welding teacher. So it's a bit of a change of pace for me, but I'm enjoying it.
I didn't know that high schools had welding teachers. At least my high school didn't.
Yeah, as of a year ago. So it's something that used to be around and went away for a long time, and now it's coming back. So
Oh, that's so cool. Is it something that you enjoy? Well, the welding aspect, it seems like you must enjoy that, but the teaching aspect.
I do, and you know, it definitely has its perks and downsides as well. But um, it's something new, and for sure. Like I mentioned before, some of the contract work that I've done in the past, you know, maybe didn't go in my favor. So
Mhm.
um, happy to make a change and kind of step away from the life that I had before.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. So how do you balance that work with your writing? Do you have a certain routine? Do you just write when you can? How does that work?
A little bit of both. I write pretty much every night when I get the kids down and kind of get some time to myself, mostly when I should be sleeping. Um, and then I also try to squeeze it in as much as I can whenever I can, even if it's 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah, you and I were talking separate from this, and you were telling me about all of the stuff that you're writing and have written, and it's like your output is pretty insane. So good for you. Good for you. I mean, it seems like something you really enjoy doing.
I do. I really love it. And, you know, I just, you get pretty good at the efficiency part when you just have to squeeze it in to lunch breaks and um, when you're driving and you speak into your phone when you have an idea, sort of thing. I used to drive about 3 hours a day for work. So a lot of those ideas kind of fester in that time.
Wow, that's nuts. Well, speaking of which, you told me recently that the writing aspect you love, obviously, but everything else, you know, putting it together and actually getting it into a physical form, you don't like as much. So, what are some things that you learned about the publishing process since you've been doing this?
When I first began with my first novel, I knew nothing about it. I don't know anybody who's into writing or into that side of things. So I didn't know that you could self-publish. So that was the biggest thing that I learned. Um, I've also learned to just go for it, just do it. Don't second guess it. Don't wait for your opportunity. Instead, just write more. So if you write a book and it's not going to be a bestseller, probably the very first one, write another one, and so on and so forth. So that's the biggest thing I've learned is don't put too much um, don't put too much weight into any one project that you do. It's more about the collection of work, I think.
Yeah. And you know, the first thing I tell people if they want to write a book, I just tell them that even if the first book isn't flat out bad, the first draft will be bad. The
Yeah.
second draft will probably be bad. And if you
Yep.
really want to stick with it, the third draft might be okay. But
Hmm.
really, that first book is all about learning how to write a book. You know,
Yeah.
you really just
Absolutely.
have to do it. So, yeah, that's great advice. And how do you feel like the reception has been for your short fiction collections versus your longer form novels? Because to me, you know, I don't know a lot of people who read short story collections in particular. That's kind of like a new thing to a lot of people when I describe it to them. So yeah, what's the reception been like?
I think the reception's been better for the short story collections, but maybe a little bit more passionate. People are people read those and they really enjoy them because it's kind of a throwback to a Goosebumps type of era. That's the short
Yes.
stories. And the novels, usually my intent with doing a novel is to be a little bit more heavy in the subject matter.
Mhm.
So maybe it's a little bit less of a fun read than the short stories. Like I said, Killers Anonymous. That's just wacky fun. That's
Yeah, well, I do love the idea of Goosebumps for adults. In fact, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Shortwave Publishing Killer VHS series, but that was actually their tagline for that series, Goosebumps for adults. So they've had Melonhead Mayhem and Candy Cane Kills so far, and they have a
yes.
couple more on their slate. So yeah, I love that idea. I remember being a kid and reading Goosebumps stories, and they're never really scary per se, but they're fun, you know? I think horror, there's a certain subset of people that really like bleak and disturbing stuff. And, me personally, I've always been drawn to the more fun aspects of horror. It's fun to be scared, you know?
Yeah, and I like to do both. So like we mentioned earlier, if you're going to read one of my books, one of them might be really fun and kind of wacky. The next one might be very bleak and the complete opposite. I guess it just depends on the whim at the time and the idea of the project. The next novel I'm going to write is a little bit more on the wild and unhinged side. Yeah.
hmm Well, do you want to talk about some of those works in progress that you have cooking up, or if they're, I mean, if they're out in the interwebs and you can talk about them, that's perfectly fine too.
I believe I can talk about everything so far. I've got a novel called Infernal Moon, which is finished, and it's been finished for quite some time. It's just like you said, getting all those other sides of everything tied up. Um, that Infernal Moon is, I don't want to say too much. Um, it's about a boy who has recurring night terrors of people being murdered, and he finds out that it's actually happening. So it's a vision. He thought it was a night terror in their visions, um, and that one's set in the past. So I wrote that after serial publication, went back to 1961. So I like to kind of ping pong around a little bit. Also have another novel called Son of a Serial Killer, also exactly how it sounds. It's about a man who discovers he's the son of the most famous or infamous serial killer of all time. So that one, I just finished writing that a couple months ago, so that'll probably be some time. But I've had a few beta readers so far, and they both really enjoyed it.
Yeah, so serial killers. What draws you to serial killers as a subject matter?
Yes, when it comes to horror, I'm much more drawn to the why as opposed to the what, let's say. So really gory movies kind of don't really entertain me as much as something like The Shining is more interesting to me than Friday the 13th, or even something more A Clockwork Orange. Always been a huge influence. It's not really horror, but um,
Oh, I'd say it is horror. Yeah.
it is in it. Yeah, it's a different type of horror
It
for
is.
sure.
Yeah, yeah, it's very psychological.
So, when you're dealing with a serial killer, you're playing with an absolutely fractured mind, and that has a lot more avenues to go down than, let's say, just the slasher.
Mhm.
So that's kind of why I gravitate more towards the serial killers. And in Son of a Serial Killer, let's say, his dad is dead, so it's dealing with the repercussions of his father being a serial killer. So it's not a slasher. So it was kind of like a new avenue that I could take that.
Yeah, and funny you say that too, because the Friday the 13th movies have never connected with me. In fact,
Yeah.
I will go on record and say I don't think there's a single good Friday the 13th movie. I like Freddy versus Jason fine enough, but I was at a time where I was a teenager, I was just getting into horror, and I was like, oh yeah, this is pretty cool, you know? But for me, something like Halloween, Michael Myers it's a way more fascinating character as a because he is a serial killer, right? And there's a certain aspect of those movies like what makes this guy tick? Oh, maybe he's just pure evil incarnate, you know? And a lot of times we really don't know what makes these people tick, and that's what makes it really frightening. So, yeah, did you study serial killers at all, either like for college or and just in your own research as a writer?
I've done a lot of research on them. Not in college, I didn't,
Mm.
and a lot of it was just fascination, and then also for writing and for writing films and things like that. Because when I was making films, I was writing my own and directing. So um, definitely put a lot of research into the personalities, the habits, this and that. And then whenever I do a serial killer now, I try not to go down the stereotypes that have been done 1,000 times before
Nice.
of serial killers. You know.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you know this, but an upcoming Mad Max Media title does involve a serial killer as one of the main characters, and I believe it is a very, very interesting subversion on the whole subgenre of serial killers. So maybe we could get you an art copy of that at some point so you could check it out.
Yeah, I'd love to. I really would.
Awesome. Okay, so do you intend at all in the near future to write in anything other than the horror and thriller space, or are you pretty comfortable writing there right now?
Um, yes, yes, I do intend to. What that's going to look like, we'll see. I definitely will probably stay on the darker fiction side as opposed to, fantasy and erotica. You're probably not going to find that for me ever.
Well,
But
yeah, well, I wasn't going to ask, but that is where I was going. Are you going to write any erotica anytime soon?
I have no plans to. But you never know where life takes you.
You know, it's not my
No,
thing. What are your thoughts on things like extreme horror or splatterpunk? Is that something that you read, or is it something you're interested in writing in at any point?
I do read a bit of it. It's not my favorite,
Mhm.
and it's not even a gross out factor. It's just, it's again, gore is not as fun to me as the other side of things. That's all. I do read a lot of Christopher Triana. He's one of my favorites,
Mhm.
but he's not maybe splatterpunk. Maybe you know, there's a lot of different levels to it. As far as writing it, I would only do so if I had another point to make,
Mhm.
kind of a la serial publication. If I had something else to mix in with that, and there happens to be extreme horror with it, then sure I would.
Yeah, I do find a lot of work that falls under that moniker of extreme horror. It's all cruelty for the sake of it. And
Yeah.
I mean some people do enjoy reading that, and I think entertainment is a spectrum and you should read what
Mhm.
you like, but I actually read something recently that really, really disturbed me. But I can admit that the writing's good. The writing's good, the structure's really good. It's just like red flags and triggers everywhere. And that's just me.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, that's fine, that's people enjoy it, and it's an art form all in itself, um, but I think the biggest thing is I'll always try to make a point as
mm,
opposed to if there's a lot of violence and gore, it'll be, secondary for sure.
definitely. Well, if we could get a little philosophical, because clearly there are a lot of things on your mind about, again, the state of news media right now and TV, reality TV. Where do you think we're headed, and what would you like to see less of and maybe more of?
Oh, that's a loaded one.
Yeah.
I'm I would call myself a traditionalist as far as I think the way that we're heading is maybe not working in everybody's best interest, and the old type of life that we used to live. Even you and I as kids, we didn't have phones in our hands and the internet and everything. It's kind of like you know omniscience, but without the capability to handle that. And I think that that's a tough thing to handle so suddenly, everything all at once. So much feedback, so much input from so many different sources. Um, versus when we were, go back to the 80s and 90s and you were a kid playing outside. And nowadays, the access that people have towards the internet and so many different sources, I think it's just overwhelming people, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. I heard some statistic. It was something wild, like with the amount of information that we have access to because of the internet and because of our phones. It's such easy access, right? A kid could, or rather, a human being could learn more in the span of a day than they could in 60 years, before the internet was created. So, and that's a wild thing, because there's a lot of stuff out there, and a lot of it's bad, a lot of it's
Mhm.
wrong, and it's getting harder and harder to decipher what's right or what you should actually pay attention to, And I think serial publication is actually a really good reflection of that, which is why I've recommended it to a lot of people.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I wrote it almost 3 years ago now, so it's great to see it have its moment, and people are starting to connect with it, and, I didn't put it out 3 years ago, but, um, I have kids myself, and it's a concern on how to raise them in a very different world from the one that we grew up in, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, I kind of miss it. I know every generation says that, but I believe you fall into the same generation as me, and we're the last generation to know what it's like to not be raised with smartphones, and
Yep,
that's a wild thing, we were around for the creation of the internet. We
yep,
actually had to research with textbooks, so it's interesting. It's interesting, and a
encyclopedias.
story like yours, it just becomes more relevant with time, which is really really cool. I think even, hey, you should make a strong marketing push this election cycle. Just like, hey guys, you should really read this, Don't worry. We're gonna do it. We're gonna make it happen.
Yeah, let's do it. And that's the thing too is with the book or with anything that I do when I'm trying to make a point, it's very much like an observation more so than like a finger pointing.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of more of like a neutral standpoint, and not to spoil the book, but that's kind of the main character Erin's progression is that she kind of just throws her hands up and goes, we can't stop this."
Yeah, and what's also interesting about it too is that there are a lot of characters who they kind of live in that morally gray area where they want to do right, but they feel like they're kind of powerless to the overall machine, which is really
Yeah,
interesting too.
which was all very much informed by my time with the three-letter agencies and the military. So
Yes, which
I,
which
I
I'm
was
assuming I can't ask about, so I won't. But that's cool. It's cool that you
no,
had
I
that
was just
background.
contracted. I was just a welder. I was never enlisted. But some of the work that you do for these people, and the maybe not in that way, but the people themselves and the things that go on, it's probably not what you hope for.
Yep. Yep.
So
Totally understand that.
yeah.
Okay, well, we have about 3 minutes left here, so let's talk about what you've been reading, if anything, or if you've been watching anything cool, or if there's anybody whose work that you want to shout out.
Um, Reading, I've been going back through a lot of old Cormac McCarthy books, who's one of my favorite authors. Watching, I don't watch a ton of TV. I'm more of a movie person, obviously. I've been going back through Christopher Nolan's films,
Okay.
um, having a good time
Cool.
with
What's your
all of
favorite Nolan?
the Prestige,
Me too. It's such a good
easily,
movie.
far and away. I just watched it twice, and I've seen it 10 times before. I watched it twice back to back
Oh,
11 times.
it's so good. It's so good.
Yeah, it's
People
awesome.
people like they love Inception and like I mean I really like oh what was that one with John David Washington um Tenet. I love
Yeah,
Tenet. It's vibes, man, but The Prestige, it like everything works in that movie. It's
yeah,
perfect.
yep. One of my favorite movies of all time.
Yep.
And then last question, who do I recommend? Um, I will give a shout out to fellow indie author Mason Marks. We are working on a split release right now. We're both going to put in some length of short novel novella together to make a split release. Also, Christopher Triana is one of my favorite as well.
Okay. I can't guarantee Christopher Triana listens to this show, but hey, maybe someday I can have a Christopher Triana on here.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
what
I'm
what
sure you could.
what has Mason Marks written? Because that's a name I'm unfamiliar with as of right now.
He's recently just finished a novel that's not been announced yet. The previous one was called The Malcontents.
Okay.
It was kind of like a Clockwork Orange meets black metal, is how I describe it. Um,
Sounds awesome.
yeah, it is. It really is. And he's a good guy. combat veteran, and just someone I've gotten to know very well over the internet over the past couple of years now. So, and then there's a bunch of great people out there. I feel bad leaving people off the list, but
That's cool. That's what you got social media for, right?
yeah,
But yeah, so this has been a really awesome discussion, and hope to have you back someday. But for the time being, I'll remind everybody that your book Serial Publication is available now, and seems like you have a lot in the pipeline. So really excited to see what you do next.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on, and I would definitely come back on anytime.